Welcome to Life Story 999. Today, we're sharing a story that will leave you breathless. In one of the city's parks, an unimaginable incident took place. A police officer, dressed in uniform, showed shocking cruelty to a young disabled girl. Her courage in the face of his anger was remarkable. But what happened afterward was even more unexpected and powerful. Stay tuned to find out how this incident unfolded and what kind of justice was ultimately served. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
It was one of those perfect sunny days, the kind that seemed made for laughter and play. The local park was buzzing with life as families gathered to celebrate the annual summer festival. The cheerful tunes of carnival music blended effortlessly with the bubbling laughter of children, while the air carried the delightful aroma of freshly popped popcorn, cotton candy, and sizzling hot dogs. Bright, colorful stalls lined the gravel pathways, each offering games, prizes, or delicious treats, making the whole park look like a page from a storybook. In the midst of it all was 8-year-old Chloe Simmons, wheeling her chair eagerly along the path. Chloe's eyes were wide with excitement, taking in every detail around her. Her wheelchair wasn't just a chair, it was her personal chariot, adorned with a constellation of superhero stickers, each one a symbol of her vibrant, daring personality. Born with cerebral palsy, Chloe's body had its challenges, but her spirit was fierce and free. She refused to let anything hold her back, her enthusiasm for life as boundless as the clear blue sky above. Her father, Marcus, sat on a nearby bench, his gaze following Chloe as she made her way towards the playground. His face softened into a warm smile as he watched her. For Marcus, today was a welcome break from the weight of his job. As an FBI agent, he was no stranger to the dark and sometimes painful side of life. The cases, the late nights, the endless chase for justice, it was often exhausting. But moments like this, watching his little girl chase her dreams in her own way, gave him the strength to keep going. Chloe was his light, a reminder of what truly mattered. Chloe wheeled herself towards the swings, her eyes lighting up at the sight of children soaring back and forth, their laughter ringing out in the warm air. She could feel the excitement bubbling inside her, her hands gripping the wheels tightly as she sped up, determined to join the fun. A gentle breeze tousled her hair, and she laughed, a sound so pure and full of joy that it made Marcus's heart swell. Marcus leaned back on the bench, taking a deep breath as he soaked in the scene. The sun was warm on his skin, and he watched as the world around him unfolded in a tapestry of colors and sounds. Chloe's courage and determination were awe-inspiring. She faced each day with a bravery that he had seen in only the best agents, and he couldn't help but marvel at her resilience. Despite the challenges she faced, Chloe never complained. Instead, she embraced life with a joy that was infectious. A few children ran past Chloe, their laughter trailing behind them, and she smiled, her eyes sparkling as they waved to her. She was used to being different, but she never let it define her. Today, she was just another kid at the summer festival, ready to have fun. As she reached the swings, a kind boy offered to help her get settled in. Chloe beamed at him, her smile as bright as the sun overhead, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a rush of pride. He had promised Chloe a day filled with fun, and seeing her so happy was everything he had hoped for. He remembered how she had woken up early that morning, her excitement barely contained as she talked non-stop about the festival. She had picked out her favorite outfit, a bright yellow sundress that matched her sunny personality, and made sure her wheelchair was ready, insisting on adding a few more superhero stickers just for the occasion. For Marcus, life was often about the pursuit of justice, about righting the wrongs he encountered daily. But here, in this park, surrounded by laughter and joy, he was reminded of the simple, beautiful moments that made all the sacrifices worthwhile. Chloe's laughter was his music, her smile his reward. He watched as she played, her face a picture of pure happiness, and he knew that no matter how tough things got, moments like these made everything worth it. The day stretched on, filled with games, treats, and laughter. Chloe tried her hand at a ring toss game, her determined expression causing Marcus to chuckle softly as he cheered her on. When she won a small stuffed bear, her triumphant grin made everyone around her smile. She wore her victories proudly, and Marcus knew that for her, each small triumph was a testament to her spirit. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the park in shades of gold and pink, Marcus felt a deep sense of contentment. Today had been a good day, a day filled with joy, laughter, and hope. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that, with Chloe by his side, they could face anything. Watching his daughter wheel herself towards the next adventure, her laughter blending with the music of the festival, Marcus knew that this day would be one they both would remember. A celebration of resilience, love, and the simple magic of being alive. The serene, cheerful atmosphere of the park shattered in an instant. Chloe, entirely focused on reaching the playground, suddenly found her way obstructed by a looming, stern figure. Officer Luke Peterson, a man well known in the community for his intimidating and harsh demeanor, stood before her, blocking her path. His presence cast a long, dark shadow, one that immediately dampened Chloe's excitement. She glanced up at him, her polite voice barely a whisper, "Excuse me, sir. May I pass?" Chloe attempted to maneuver her wheelchair around him, but each time she tried, Officer Peterson deliberately moved to block her, his stance rigid and unyielding. His eyes bore down on her, cold and unfeeling. "Out of the way, brat!" he barked, his voice dripping with disdain. His words, sharp and cruel, cut through Chloe like a knife. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, the joy she had felt moments earlier replaced by a rising sense of fear. She had faced unkindness before, but never something so charged with malice. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, her excitement now replaced with confusion. She looked up at the towering officer, her small voice quivering, "I just wanted to play." It was as if her words bounced off him, leaving no impression. The officer's face twisted into a sneer, a look of pure contempt etched across his features. He took a step forward, his shadow enveloping her entirely. "You don't belong here," he spat out, his voice cold and cutting. Chloe shrank back slightly, her fingers tightening on the wheels of her chair. Across the park, Marcus, who had been watching his daughter from a distance, suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. The bustling energy of the park seemed to shift, a sudden change in the air that he couldn't ignore. His eyes quickly scanned the playground until they locked onto Chloe's distinctive blue wheelchair. Something was wrong. The smile that had rested so easily on his face vanished, replaced by a feeling of dread. Without hesitation, Marcus set his coffee down and stood up abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene unfolding across the park. In that moment, his instincts as both a father and an FBI agent kicked in. Chloe was in trouble. He could see her tiny form blocked by the imposing figure of Officer Peterson, her small face turned up toward him in fear. Marcus's heart began to pound, each beat echoing the urgency of the situation. He didn't waste a second. Marcus sprinted toward the playground, his long strides eating up the distance between him and his daughter. His eyes, once filled with warmth, now burned with fierce determination. He pushed through the crowd, his focus solely on Chloe, whose expression of confusion and fear fueled his every step. The carefree sounds of the festival seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the rush of blood pounding in his ears. As Marcus closed in, he could hear Officer Peterson's hateful words and see the twisted sneer on his face. Fury surged through him, a primal, protective anger. This man, this officer, was threatening his little girl, and that was something Marcus would never tolerate. The distance between them narrowed, and Marcus felt his body tensing, preparing for whatever would come next. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: Chloe needed him, and nothing else mattered. Chloe looked up, her eyes catching sight of her father as he approached. The fear in her gaze eased just a fraction, replaced by a glimmer of hope. Marcus was there, and if there was one thing Chloe knew, it was that her father would always protect her. Marcus reached the scene, his voice booming, filled with authority and unmistakable fury. "What do you think you're doing?" His presence was undeniable, his tone leaving no room for argument. Officer Peterson turned, momentarily startled by the sudden interruption, his sneer faltering under Marcus's piercing glare. The confrontation was far from over, but in that moment, Chloe knew she wasn't alone. Her father was there, and somehow that made all the difference. Before Marcus could reach them, Officer Peterson did the unthinkable. He raised his hand and struck Chloe across the face. The sharp crack of the slap echoed across the park, shattering the festive atmosphere in an instant. It was as if the world itself had stopped. Laughter faded into silence, the cheerful music stuttered to an abrupt halt in people's minds, and all eyes turned toward the source of the commotion. Chloe's small hand flew up to her cheek, her eyes widening in disbelief as tears welled. The pain was not only physical, it was the betrayal, the shock of having her innocence shattered by such cruelty. Parents across the park instinctively pulled their children close, shielding them from the scene unfolding before them. Several onlookers pulled out their phones, their hands trembling as they began recording, evidence of an unimaginable act that had stolen the joy of a sunlit afternoon. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd, disbelief giving way to anger, voices hushed but tinged with outrage. Marcus reached Chloe just as the first tears rolled down her cheeks. The sight of his daughter, her face streaked with pain and confusion, ignited a fury in him that was hotter and more consuming than anything he had ever felt. Rage surged through his veins, white-hot and unstoppable. In that moment, every ounce of his training, every shred of his usual calm was replaced by a father's primal instinct to protect. Marcus stepped between Officer Peterson and Chloe, his stance rigid and powerful, a living wall of defense. His eyes blazed with anger, his entire being trembling with it. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice echoing with an intensity that silenced even the murmurs around them. For a split second, Officer Peterson hesitated. He had not expected this, not expected to be challenged so forcefully. But his pride was wounded, and rather than back down, he decided to double down. He squared his shoulders, attempting to regain his dominance. "Stay out of this," Peterson snapped, but the confidence he had wielded so effortlessly before was gone, replaced by a note of uncertainty that betrayed him. The crowd had grown thicker, their outrage simmering just beneath the surface. What had begun as a cheerful day at the park had turned into something far darker. Whispers of disbelief turned to murmurs of protest, the gathered onlookers appalled by what they had seen. Children clung to their parents, their once carefree laughter replaced by confusion as they watched the confrontation. Marcus's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening as he took another step toward Peterson, his voice low and filled with barely contained rage. "You put your hands on my daughter. My daughter!" He could barely control the tremor in his voice. His words were like a promise, one that did not bode well for Peterson. Chloe, still sitting in her wheelchair, looked up at her father, her tears continuing to spill. She could see the tension in Marcus's frame, the fury in his eyes, and despite her fear, she felt a spark of safety knowing he was there. The pain in her cheek throbbed, but her father's presence was a balm, a shield against the horror of the moment. Officer Peterson shifted, visibly uncomfortable now. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, the judgment in their gazes. What had seemed like a simple power play had spiraled out of control. He took a step back, but Marcus was relentless, advancing on him, his presence overpowering. "You think you can bully a child?" Marcus growled, his voice carrying the weight of his fury. "You think you can lay a hand on my daughter and just walk away?" Peterson tried to hold his ground, but his bravado was cracking, the weight of what he had done finally sinking in. He glanced around, seeing nothing but hostile faces, phones pointed at him, recording every second of his disgrace. The murmurs in the crowd began to grow louder, turning into shouts of anger. "You can't do that," someone yelled. "Justice for Chloe," another voice called. The collective outrage of the bystanders became a powerful force, and Officer Peterson, once so confident, now looked as though he wanted to vanish. Marcus turned briefly to glance at Chloe, his gaze softening for a heartbeat as he met her tearful eyes. He took a deep breath, the raw anger in him mixing with something else, a deep, unyielding love for his daughter. He knelt down beside her, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing noise of the crowd. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Chloe nodded, her small hands trembling as she held onto the arm of her wheelchair. In the distance, the distinct wail of sirens began to grow louder, cutting through the chaotic buzz of the park. Someone had called the police, and backup was on the way. Marcus stood up again, his eyes locking onto Peterson's. The officer's bravado had completely vanished, replaced by a look of uncertainty, and perhaps just a hint of fear. Marcus stepped forward once more, his voice a low growl. "You're going to answer for this. You're not getting away with it." The tension in the air was palpable, thick and heavy, as the crowd shifted, making way for the approaching police cars. The officers who arrived took one look at the scene, the crying child, the furious father, the pale and shaken Peterson, and understood that this was not something they could brush aside. They approached cautiously, the crowd parting for them, their faces a mix of outrage and expectation. One of the officers stepped forward, his eyes flicking between Marcus and Peterson. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice trying to project authority, though the unease was clear. Marcus didn't hesitate. He pointed at Peterson, his voice strong and unwavering. "This man assaulted my daughter. He needs to be arrested. The officer looked to Peterson, who stammered, trying to find the words to defend himself, but the evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses, the videos, the red mark on Chloe's cheek. As the officers moved to detain Peterson, the crowd erupted in a mix of cheers and cries for justice. Marcus knelt again beside Chloe, wrapping his arms around her gently, his heart aching for what she had just endured. He kissed the top of her head, whispering, "I've got you. You're safe now." The festival's cheerful mood was gone, replaced by a shared sense of determination. What had begun as a day of joy had turned into a moment of reckoning, one that would not be forgotten by anyone who had witnessed it. Marcus held Chloe close, his heart still pounding, knowing that this was only the beginning. There would be questions, investigations, and challenges ahead. But as he looked at his daughter, he knew one thing for certain. He would fight for her, protect her, and ensure that justice was served. "You think you can hurt my daughter and just walk away?" Marcus said, his voice low and charged with a dark promise. There was no mistaking the intensity in his tone, the vow of retribution lacing every word. Officer Peterson faltered, his face suddenly draining of color as realization dawned on him. He had miscalculated, badly. The man standing before him wasn't just any angry parent. He was an FBI agent, and not one to back down from a fight, especially when it involved his child. A man who would pursue justice relentlessly, no matter the cost. The tension thickened with each passing second, the atmosphere heavy and electric as the crowd continued to grow. Many onlookers had their phones raised, recording the incident, capturing every word, every glance, every tremor of fear in Peterson's eyes. The world was watching, and the weight of it began to settle on the officer's shoulders. In the distance, the unmistakable wail of sirens grew louder, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Backup had arrived, but not for Peterson, for the people gathered, for the voices rising in outrage, demanding justice for the young girl who had been wronged. 2 squad cars pulled up at the edge of the park, their lights flashing urgently. Uniformed officers rushed out, their faces tense as they surveyed the scene before them. It was clear from the outset that this was no ordinary confrontation. They hurried over, their goal not to defend Peterson but to de-escalate the volatile situation. The crowd's mood had shifted from disbelief to anger, the simmering fury of those who had witnessed a grave injustice committed in broad daylight. Officer Peterson's arrogance evaporated as quickly as it had surfaced, his bluster collapsing under the weight of the crowd's reaction. He looked around, his once confident demeanor now replaced by a growing sense of fear. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, cold, judging, unforgiving. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry, and took an involuntary step back. The realization of what he had done, and who he had done it to, washed over him in a wave of panic. Marcus, his rage still simmering beneath the surface, cast a quick glance back at Chloe. Her small, tear-streaked face seemed to shine with a mixture of pain and resilience. The sight of her, sitting there, trying to be brave, cut him deeper than any blow ever could. But it also filled him with an unshakable resolve. His daughter needed him now more than ever, and he would not fail her. He turned his focus back to Peterson, his gaze as hard as steel. "You're going to answer for this," Marcus said, his voice steady and unwavering. It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact. There was no escaping this, no way to undo what had been done. Peterson's actions had consequences, and Marcus was going to make sure he faced every single one of them. The approaching officers hesitated for a moment, assessing the situation. One of them, a senior officer by the looks of it, stepped forward, his eyes darting between Marcus, Peterson, and Chloe. He raised a hand, his voice projecting authority even though there was an edge of uncertainty in it. "All right, everyone needs to calm down," he called out. "We need to get a handle on this situation." Marcus, without breaking his intense gaze on Peterson, spoke in a voice that was both calm and lethal. "This man assaulted my daughter. He struck her unprovoked." His words carried across the gathering, each syllable ringing with the weight of truth. The officer looked at Chloe, her tear-streaked face, the redness still visible on her cheek, and then back at Peterson, who had gone pale. It was clear that the situation was not in Peterson's favor. The crowd's murmurs rose in volume, the anger in their voices now palpable. "Justice for Chloe," someone shouted, and others quickly joined in. The chant grew louder, rolling through the crowd like a wave, each voice adding to the momentum until it became impossible to ignore. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that the situation was spiraling beyond their control. The senior officer gestured to two of his subordinates. "Take him into custody," he said, nodding towards Peterson. For a moment, disbelief flashed across Peterson's face. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. The reality of his situation struck him like a blow. There would be no easy way out of this. The officers stepped forward, each grabbing one of his arms, and began to lead him away. As they pulled Peterson back, the senior officer approached Marcus, his voice lower, more respectful. "Sir, we need to take statements and get this situation under control. I understand you're upset, but we need to proceed with protocol." Marcus nodded, his face still a mask of controlled fury, but he understood. There was a process to this, and as much as he wanted to let his rage take over, he knew that following the right steps was the way to ensure that justice was truly served. Chloe watched as the officers took Peterson away, her heart pounding in her chest. She still felt the sting of his slap, the humiliation of being treated so cruelly. But now, seeing him being taken away, seeing the crowd stand with her, she felt something else, a flicker of hope. Her father was there, standing tall, and she knew that he would never let anyone hurt her without a fight. Marcus knelt down beside Chloe, his expression softening as he looked at her. He reached out, gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "Hey, it's going to be all right," he whispered. "I promise you, no one will ever hurt you like this again." Chloe nodded, her small hands trembling as she reached for her father's arm. Marcus pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her close as he tried to steady his own breathing. The adrenaline, the fear, the anger, it was all still there, but he needed to be strong for her. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, the tension slowly easing as the officers moved to restore order. Some approached Marcus, offering words of support, promising that they had captured everything on video, that they would help however they could. Marcus thanked them, his voice thick with emotion. He knew that this wasn't over. There would be questions, investigations, possibly even a trial. But he also knew that they weren't alone. The community had seen what had happened, and they stood by his side. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park. What had started as a day of joy had turned into a moment of reckoning, but as Marcus looked down at Chloe, he knew that they would get through this. Together. He lifted her gently from her wheelchair, holding her close as he began to carry her back towards their car. Chloe rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes closing as the exhaustion of the day began to take over. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with a quiet, unbreakable determination. "No matter what, I've got you." And as they walked away from the crowd, the flashing lights, and the chaos of the park, Marcus knew that he would do whatever it took to protect his daughter, to fight for her, and to ensure that the world knew that no one could hurt her and walk away. The officers arriving on the scene quickly assessed the situation, their eyes scanning the angry faces in the crowd, the many phones still raised, capturing every detail of what had happened. It didn't take long for them to understand the gravity of the incident. The people's fury was palpable, and the evidence was undeniable. Without hesitation, they made the decision to take Officer Peterson into custody. There was no other choice. As they placed him in handcuffs, Officer Peterson's face was a mix of disbelief and desperation. He cast one last glance towards Marcus and Chloe, his eyes wide with a pleading that spoke of fear and regret. But the look Marcus gave him in return was cold, devoid of any sympathy. In Marcus's eyes was a promise. This was far from over. Peterson's actions would not be forgotten, and there would be justice, no matter how long it took. With Peterson being led away, the crowd began to slowly disperse, the tension that had gripped the park easing but not vanishing entirely. The energy of the festival had been replaced by something else, an unspoken understanding among those who had gathered. Many stayed behind, coming over to Marcus and Chloe, their faces filled with compassion and support. Strangers offered their words of comfort, their hands reaching out to Marcus's shoulder or to Chloe's small hand, their eyes soft with understanding. A young woman approached, her phone still in her hand. She looked at Marcus, her expression resolute. "I got everything on video," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If you need it, for anything, I'm here to help." Marcus nodded, gratitude tightening his throat. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice heavy with emotion. Each person who approached them, each recording that was offered, each promise of support, felt like a lifeline. He knew this was just the beginning. What had happened today was not something that could be forgotten or brushed aside. It was the start of a long, grueling road, one that would be paved with legal battles, difficult conversations, and moments that would test his resolve. But it was also a road that needed to be traveled, not just for Chloe but for every child who deserved to feel safe, for every person who had ever faced injustice. Chloe, still sitting in her wheelchair, looked up at the people gathered around her. Her cheek was still red from where Peterson had struck her, but her eyes were wide, taking in everything. The fear that had gripped her was slowly being replaced by something else, a sense of strength that came from seeing so many people standing by her side. She looked at her father, her eyes searching his face. Marcus knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice soft, the anger that had burned in him now replaced by a deep, aching concern. Chloe nodded slowly, her lips trembling but managing a small, brave smile. "I think so, Daddy," she whispered. Marcus felt his heart twist, a mix of pride and sorrow filling him. He pulled her into a gentle hug, his arms wrapping around her protectively. One of the officers approached them, his expression cautious yet respectful. "Sir," he began, his voice low, "we need to take your statement and your daughter's statement as well. We want to make sure everything is documented properly." Marcus nodded, glancing at Chloe. He knew she was tired, that the day had taken so much out of her, but this was important. It was the first step toward ensuring that Peterson faced the consequences of his actions. "Chloe," Marcus said gently, pulling back to look at her, "they need to ask you a few questions. Are you up for it?" Chloe looked at the officer, her eyes still glistening with tears, but she nodded. "I can do it," she said, her voice small but steady. Marcus felt a swell of pride. His daughter was brave, braver than he could ever have imagined. The officer gave Chloe a kind smile before gesturing for them to follow him to one of the squad cars where they could sit and speak more comfortably. As Marcus wheeled Chloe over, he glanced back at the crowd that was still lingering, watching, waiting. He saw their determination, their readiness to support, and it gave him strength. He turned back to Chloe, giving her an encouraging nod. The interviews were brief but thorough. Chloe answered the questions as best as she could, her voice growing stronger with each word. Marcus watched her, his heart swelling with pride. She was resilient, facing something that no child should ever have to endure, but she was doing it with courage. When the officer finished, he thanked them both, assuring Marcus that Peterson was being taken to the station for processing and that their statements, along with the recordings from the crowd, would be crucial in ensuring justice was served. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Marcus looked at his daughter, his heart heavy but hopeful. Today had been one of the hardest days of their lives, but it had also shown them something important, something powerful. They were not alone. The community had rallied around them, strangers had become allies, and together they would fight for what was right. "Let's go home, Chloe," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Chloe nodded, her small hand reaching for his. As they made their way to their car, Marcus knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But as long as he had Chloe by his side, as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, he knew they could face whatever came next. Together they would fight. And together they would heal. 2 days later, Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces before him. Hundreds had gathered for the rally, their determination as evident as the signs they held aloft. Bold words calling for justice, for accountability, for change. The air was thick with emotion, the energy of the crowd palpable, a unified force that had come together for one reason, Chloe. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself as he stepped up to the microphone. He glanced down at Chloe, who sat in her wheelchair just below the steps, her eyes wide as she took in the crowd. Her face still bore the faint bruise from that horrible day, but her spirit was far from broken. Seeing her there, Marcus felt a surge of emotion, a mix of pride, love, and a fierce determination that had carried him through the past few days. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "We are here today not just because of what happened to my daughter Chloe, but because of what it represents. This isn't just about one incident. This is about a system that allows people like Officer Peterson to act without consequence, that enables those who are meant to protect us to instead harm us without fear of accountability." The crowd responded with a roar of applause, their voices echoing through the square, reverberating off the stone walls of City Hall. Marcus paused, letting the applause wash over him, feeling the strength of their support like a wave pushing him forward. He caught Chloe's eye, her small smile giving him the courage he needed to continue. For far too long, Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength, we have allowed a culture of silence to shield those who abuse their power. My daughter was assaulted by someone who swore an oath to serve and protect. She was made to feel powerless, to feel like she didn't belong. But she does belong. Chloe belongs here, just like every child in this community deserves to feel safe and protected. The crowd erupted again, their cheers louder this time, filled with passion. The signs waved in the air, justice for Chloe, end police brutality, accountability now. The voices of the people, mothers, fathers, children, neighbors, all of them rose in unison, a collective demand for change. Marcus felt the weight of his own words, the truth of them resonating deep within him. He had spent his career pursuing justice, but this, standing here, speaking for his daughter, for every person who had ever felt voiceless, this was the most important fight of his life. He looked out over the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had come to stand with him. He saw anger, yes, but also hope. Hope that together, they could make a difference. We need change, Marcus said, his voice ringing out across the square. We need accountability. We need to ensure that no other child, no other family, has to go through what Chloe has endured. We need to demand better from those who wear the badge, from those who are entrusted with our safety. He paused, the silence of the crowd hanging heavily, waiting for his next words. Today, we stand together, he said, his voice softening but losing none of its strength. Today, we tell those in power that we will not be silent. We will not stop until justice is served, until every child can walk, or wheel, through a park without fear. Until every officer knows that their actions will have consequences. Chloe watched her father, her heart swelling with pride. She saw the way the people looked at him, how his words seemed to reach into their hearts, stirring something within them. She may have felt scared that day in the park, but today, surrounded by so many people who cared, she felt something else, hope. The crowd erupted once more, the cheers and applause deafening. People began to chant, their voices growing louder and more insistent. Justice for Chloe! Justice for Chloe! The chant spread, rolling through the square, picking up momentum until it seemed as though the very air was vibrating with their call for change. Marcus stepped back from the microphone, his eyes misting over as he looked down at Chloe. She smiled up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. He stepped down from the platform, moving toward her, kneeling beside her wheelchair. He reached out, taking her small hand in his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. We're going to do this, sweetheart. We're going to make things right. Chloe nodded, her heart full. She squeezed her father's hand, her voice filled with quiet determination as she answered. I know, Daddy. I believe you. As the chants continued, as the crowd held their signs high and their voices even higher, Marcus felt a sense of hope unlike any he had ever felt before. This was just the beginning, a beginning born from pain, but also from love, resilience, and the promise of a better future. Together, they would fight. Together, they would make a difference. And together, they would ensure that Chloe, and every child like her, could live without fear. The trial that followed was grueling, stretching over days that felt like weeks. Each day, Marcus walked into the courtroom with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew this was not just about Chloe, it was about every child, every innocent person who had ever faced injustice at the hands of those sworn to protect them. He was determined to see this through, no matter how difficult it became. When it was his turn to testify, Marcus took the stand, his heart heavy as he relived every painful detail of that day in the park. He spoke of the joy on Chloe's face as she wheeled towards the swings, of the shock and rage that had coursed through him when he saw Officer Peterson strike her. His voice wavered at times, the raw emotion of the moment threatening to overwhelm him, but he pushed through it, holding on to the image of his daughter's brave face. He was doing this for her, for Chloe, and for every child who deserved to feel safe. The prosecution presented their case methodically, calling on witnesses who had been at the park that day. They testified to what they had seen, the unprovoked aggression, the cruelty, and the fear in Chloe's eyes. The videos taken by bystanders were played in court, the footage capturing every moment of Peterson's actions and the immediate reaction of the crowd. The evidence was damning, and as each witness spoke, Marcus could feel the tension in the courtroom shift. There was no denying what had happened. The defense, in contrast, tried to paint Peterson as an officer under extreme stress, a man who had simply made a mistake in the heat of the moment. They spoke of his years of service, of the challenges and pressures that came with the job. But the arguments fell hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. The videos, the witness testimonies, the visible mark on Chloe's cheek that had taken days to fade. There was no excuse for what he had done, and Marcus could see it in the faces of the jury, the growing understanding that this was not a momentary lapse, but an abuse of power. The wait for the jury's decision felt endless. Marcus sat beside Chloe, his hand holding hers tightly as they waited. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with anticipation. He could feel Chloe's small fingers trembling slightly, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze, offering her the reassurance that he himself was struggling to find. When the jury finally returned, the foreperson stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Luke Peterson, guilty of all charges." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then a wave of relief crashed over Marcus, nearly knocking the breath out of him. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek as the tension he had held for so long began to ease. Beside him, Chloe looked up, her eyes wide. A small smile spread across her face, tentative at first, and then brighter. Marcus looked down at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He reached over, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "We did it, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick. "We took the first step." Chloe nodded, her smile growing as she leaned into her father. "We did it, Daddy," she whispered back, her voice filled with hope. As the courtroom began to stir, people standing, murmuring amongst themselves, Marcus pulled Chloe into a gentle hug. He knew this was just one step, a significant one, but still only the beginning of a longer journey. There would be more battles to fight, more changes to demand. But today they had won. Today they had shown that there was accountability, that there could be justice. As they left the courtroom, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He looked down at Chloe, who wheeled beside him, her face lifted to the sun as they stepped outside. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged stronger. And as they moved forward, Marcus knew that he would continue to fight, not just for Chloe, but for every person who deserved to be seen, to be heard, and to be protected. After the trial, the community's voice only grew stronger. They had witnessed injustice, and now they were determined to ensure that real change followed. People gathered in town halls, held vigils, and organized rallies, no longer willing to accept the status quo. Their unified message was clear. It was time for true accountability and meaningful reform. The police department, feeling the pressure of the public's call for action, announced a series of reforms. These included mandatory sensitivity training for all officers, as well as the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review incidents involving the use of force. It was a small step, but it was a beginning, progress that gave people hope. Marcus knew it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a sign that their voices had been heard, that the system could change if they pushed hard enough. Marcus continued to speak at community meetings, his presence becoming a familiar and reassuring figure for many. He shared Chloe's story over and over, each time with the same raw honesty and determination. He spoke about her bravery, about the fear she had faced, and about the strength that had emerged from that dark day. His words resonated with people, touching their hearts and inspiring others to join the movement for reform. He knew that the journey ahead was still long, that the changes they sought would not happen overnight. There were still barriers to break, still attitudes to challenge. But as he stood in front of those gatherings, seeing the faces of the people who were there, some old, some young, parents with their children, activists who had fought for years, he felt a renewed sense of hope. With every meeting, every rally, Marcus felt the momentum building. It wasn't just about Chloe anymore. It was about ensuring that no other child, no other family, would have to endure what they had gone through. It was about creating a community where people could feel safe, where they could trust those meant to protect them. And though it was a small step, Marcus knew they were moving in the right direction, one step at a time, together. Chloe, too, began to find her own voice in the aftermath of everything that had happened. She no longer wanted to be just a part of the story. She wanted to be a force for change. One day, inspired by the courage she had seen in her father and the support from her community, Chloe decided to create a school project titled, "Stand Up for What's Right." It was more than just an assignment. It was her way of turning her experience into something powerful, something that could make a difference. With her project, Chloe shared her story, the fear she had felt that day in the park, the shock of being treated so cruelly, and the hope that had been born from the support of so many people. She spoke candidly to her classmates about injustice, about the importance of standing up not just for themselves but for others as well. Her words carried weight beyond her years, her bravery and sincerity resonating deeply with her peers. Chloe's message was simple yet powerful. No one should be made to feel small, and every voice matters in the fight against wrong. Her classmates were captivated by her presentation, moved by her honesty and her courage. They saw Chloe not just as the girl in the wheelchair but as a leader, someone who had faced darkness and found the strength to push back. They began to talk about issues they saw in their own lives, sharing their own stories of unfairness and how they, too, could stand up for what was right. It sparked something, a ripple effect that began to spread throughout the school, inspiring others to speak out, to be brave, and to support one another. Seeing Chloe's courage had an impact far beyond the classroom. Her father, Marcus, was deeply moved by her determination. Watching her stand in front of her peers, speaking so fearlessly, filled him with a renewed sense of pride and hope. Chloe was not just his daughter, she was a beacon of strength, a symbol of what could happen when people refused to be silenced. She had faced injustice head-on, and now, she was using her voice to make sure others knew they could do the same. One day, Marcus and Chloe returned to the park together, the place where everything had begun. It was quiet, the swing swaying gently in the breeze, the gravel path glistening in the sunlight. As they walked along the path, Chloe looked around, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. There was no fear there anymore, only a sense of resilience and closure. She had faced the darkness, and now, standing there beside her father, she knew they had emerged stronger. Marcus knelt beside her wheelchair, his eyes meeting hers. "You're amazing, you know that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Chloe smiled, reaching for his hand. "We're amazing," she replied. And as they sat there together, they knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to do, but they were ready. Together, they would continue to stand up for what was right. The incident that day changed Chloe's life and became a turning point for the entire community. It ignited a movement for accountability and justice, a fight that Marcus and Chloe would continue. Their story is a reminder that standing up against wrongdoing, even when it's difficult, can lead to change. Thank you for watching this story on Life Story 999. If this story moved you, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire change. Your voice can make a difference. Let's continue to stand up for what's right together.